Medical Mariner, Inc.
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you live from our Norfolk studio, home of the Atlantic Fleet, Medical Mariner, Inc.
Welcome to the Medical Mariner, Inc. podcast, hosted by Paul Stewart. Here we will be talking about my life journey, things I have done and learned along the way. Topics of discussion will include medicine, scuba diving, tattoos, growing things, resilient living, learning new things, and more. Hello. Today's episode is called I Blame Jeff and Jesus. In this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about how I got started doing a podcast. We're also going to talk about what made it possible for me to have the time to be doing this right now. And we're going to talk some about how I see this going in the future. The title of this podcast probably needs some explanation. It's a little bit of a weird title. So there's lots of folks that have been integral to the things I've been able to do and accomplish, but there's two people that are really responsible for you getting to hear this podcast today. And that's my good friend Jeff Samsel and Jesus. That seems to be a little bit of a weird combination, but we'll talk through it as we get through here. So now, Jeff Samsel, who is that guy? Why is he responsible for me starting a podcast? Well, he is a friend of mine. Me doing the podcast was his idea, and he actually suggested it to me probably at the only time it would have made sense for me to actually sit down and start doing this. On October 12th of 2024, that's about 2 months prior to this recording, I was finishing up my dive master training, and I slipped as I was coming out of the water wearing a set of steel doubles and fell and dislocated my left shoulder. That was a pretty painful and very significant injury. So I normally work as an ERPA. I was also working as a local medical examiner for the state of Virginia and also as an urgent care PA. Since I have injured my shoulder, I've had to be out of all those jobs because the stress of working as a PA, what it can do to your shoulder. I'm unable to do that at this time. Also, in addition to all that, I was, of course, finishing up my dive master certification in my spare time, which fortunately I had accomplished. When I fell, I actually tore my supraspinatus tendon. That's the muscle that goes right over here on the top of your rotator cuff and is one of the things that holds all this stuff together. Also had a minor partial tear of the infraspinatus tendon. Basically, that means I had a pretty serious rotator cuff injury that made my shoulder really unstable and needed surgical repair. I was fortunate enough to get to the surgeon fairly quickly. He was able to examine the imaging of my shoulder, and it was kind of funny because he asked me when I thought I might want to get it done. And since we were in there on a Monday, I said, how about Thursday? And he said, I don't know. I'm getting hip surgery coming up. My schedule is really filled with the time that I'm having to spend to get ready for that and everything. Then his scheduler came in and said, how about Wednesday? So I was super fortunate in that 2 days from when I had my initial surgical consultation, I was able to get that shoulder operated on. So thank you, Dr. Jody Smith with Ortho Virginia, for doing an outstanding job there. So after I had that surgery, I was talking on the phone with Jeff, and he and I were kind of, going back over, talking about things from the past. And he's like mentioning to me that he does a podcast now. It's called Beekeeping for Newbies. It's actually the #1 beekeeping podcast in the United Arab Emirates, I do believe. And then he said, you know what? Maybe you should start a podcast. I thought, okay, we'll see about that. Now, the way I know Jeff is I used to be a sales engineer. I was tied to a somewhat interesting sales representative that some folks thought was difficult to work with. I found it to be pretty okay working with him. I'm not sure what that says about me, but at one point I moved from being his engineer into managing that engineering team, and that meant he needed an engineer to hang out with him and do his engineering work. I had interviewed Jeff, hired him in there, and turns out that relationship didn't work out so well, but Jeff and I stayed friends, and we've kept in touch over the years. We've done some things over time together. He lives down by Virginia Beach, so we go and visit him and his wife every now and then. Also, he and I are both military veterans, so we have some things to talk about there. And at one point a long time ago, he and I and another friend of mine, Brandon, all went and got certified as NRA instructors, as a bright idea I had as a money-making scheme at one point. That might be something we talk about later as well. Now, the way Jeff got into having his beekeeping podcast might be related to an off-the-cuff remark I made to him one day. I'm not sure, what sparked the initial conversation. I did used to keep bees. I had this batch of carnelians that had PTSD. They swarmed, moved into the wall of somebody's house. They tried to get them out with insecticide and smoking them and all kinds of things. I got a call one day from a guy named Dave. He was in the beekeeping club up in Prince William County. And he's like, "Hey man, I don't have any empty hives. Do you have an empty hive where I can put this swarm of carnelians I rescued?" And I said, "Sure." I had an empty hive. So he brought them over and we put them in there. Those bees must have had PTSD or something, because man, I'd be out there mowing my lawn, and my other Italian bees, they'd be all hanging out happy. They'd let me do my thing. And invariably, one or two of those carnies would come over and zap me and sting me. I didn't like them, and I was kind of happy when they decided to abscond with their honey and pack up and leave. Anyway, so back to how I met Jeff. Apparently, one day he was in the office. Not sure if I had a big sting on my face with half my face swollen up from those carnies getting me, or maybe I had a jar of honey that I just harvested or something, but according to Jeff, I said something like, "Yeah, man, I've been keeping bees for a little while now, and you should too." And he decided to go ahead and do that and take that for action. And he got way into it, much deeper than I had. He's quite an excellent beekeeper. He had a large bee yard, from what I understand. I'm not sure how big his apiary ever got to be, but we'll probably talk to him some about that. And you actually got to hear his voice a little bit. He does the announcer segment when we're coming in here. So I don't keep bees anymore. I sold that house. I don't think Jeff has an active apiary at this time, but Jeff was telling me about his beekeeping podcast. And then, like I said earlier, he told me, "Man, maybe you should start a podcast." Got to say, I was a little bit skeptical at first. However, I do know that my doctor is going to let me go back to work here starting in February, so I was starting to try to line up some times that I could get back to work and things like that, looking at doing some locums work, some travel jobs. That kind of stuff we'll probably talk about in another episode. And I was talking to one of the recruiters, and there were lots of pauses while she was going through some stuff. And I'd mentioned some work I'd done in Africa, and we started talking about some of those stories. And she seemed really interested about those. And that started getting me seriously thinking, well, maybe the starting a podcast thing might work out, because there's probably some folks that they might want to listen to some of the things I have to say. So that, in a nutshell, is what is making this Jeff's fault. If he hadn't suggested it, I probably never would have done it. After his suggestion, I went out, got myself a microphone, got a little bit of a setup going. So we're working through it, and we're seeing how it's going. Now we get to the part about why I blame Jesus. Kind of sounds a little weird, blaming Jesus. I guess not. Lots of folks blame Jesus for a lot of things. I want to make sure that I am very clear here. I'm not trying to coerce anybody into taking on my beliefs. That's not the point of this podcast. That's not my job. But I am a follower of Jesus. He's had a lot of influence on my life, and he's actually gotten me into situations where I've done a lot of things that I wouldn't have done otherwise without being a follower of Jesus. Probably the biggest one being changing my career from being in IT sales and engineering to being a medical provider, which actually took a fair amount of time, effort, and not a small outlay of cash that I'm still paying off. So it would be kind of dishonest if I left that piece out. This is going to be a little bit of a condensed version of how we got to where we are after I started following Jesus. So in 2010, that is when I actually became a follower of Jesus. The way that happened exactly was I knew this guy, Lewis Hardy. He was married to the friend of an ex-girlfriend of mine. At the time, he was going to New Hope Church in Wharton, Virginia, and I called him up one morning and said, "Hey, why don't you take me to church?" He said, "All right, come pick me up." So I picked him up, went down there, and boom, that was a life-changing moment. As we're going to find out over the course of this podcast, usually when I decide to do something, I tie about 50 pounds of lead to my feet and jump both feet into the deep end and see where it goes. And that's what I did. Not long after accepting Jesus, getting baptized, and attending New Hope Church, I was there one day. One of the young ladies that goes there, her name's Jenny Herzog, she was talking about a trip that she was going to do to Uganda with Hope for Kids International. That's a not-for-profit organization I've done a lot of work with over some of my mission trips to Africa. Anyway, I decided, that sounds interesting. Never been to Africa or Uganda before. Let's go check it out. So I did. Went over there, had a lot of fun. We're going to have some episodes that talk about things like whitewater rafting on the Nile, going out on safari, going on medical missions, going into orphanages and feeding orphans, those types of things. But on this particular trip, the one thing that really stood out to me and changed me was they had a medical outreach that they were going on to a town called Busia. I'd never been there before. Busia is probably about halfway between two towns called Tororo and Jinja in Uganda. They're on the eastern side. So we went out there. They were doing all this medical work in some buildings without electricity. They'd said you could have all comers. You did not have to have medical experience to attend this medical outreach. So I did. Got along pretty well with most of the providers, actually made really good friends with one of them in particular. Her name's Dr. Amy Stone. And she's integral to the reason that I got more experience in the medical field. She actually encouraged me to go out there and learn more and get more training and get to where I guess I am today as a physician assistant. Now, up until that medical outreach, I didn't have a lot of experience in medicine. I'd been a lifeguard as a teen. I'd been a orderly at Mary Washington Hospital in Fredericksburg, Virginia, the old hospital that's now an office building over on the south side of Route 1 and Fall Hill Avenue, if you're familiar with that area. However, after the medical outreach, I came back. Amy had encouraged me to get more training, so I started in volunteering with the Prince William County Fire Department at Buck Hall VFD out there on Yates Ford Road. Went to EMT school, got my EMT certification, and that was my entry into medicine. Kept getting more interested. A few years later, I was thinking about getting my medic certification just so I could be a little bit better at what I was doing when I was on these missions. And in there, while I was doing that, studying for that, I actually went on a mission trip to Guatemala with the New Hope Church youth group, and my wife was on that mission trip. That might be a whole separate story in and of itself at some time. It is reported by our daughter, Taryn, that on that trip, she said, "Mommy, why don't you date Mr. Paul?" And my wife responded with, "Ooh, gross." She denies that. Maybe I'll let her speak about that at some point. However, I was taking a chemistry course at that point in there, and we got back to the States, and I had actually been working for a contract for the government and was looking to take a leave of absence for the summer to go to Uganda for several months and work in some of the clinics over there. I was working with both Hope for Kids International and another great group called Outreach to Africa. So when I asked them if they would give me a leave of absence, they said no. And I said, well, okay, then I guess I'm going to have to quit. So I quit my job and I went to Uganda and I worked in those clinics, had some great experiences, got to do some things that a lot of folks don't really get to do in Africa. And we'll talk about those in other episodes. Got to meet several kings, got to do lots of interesting medicine, and got to go to a couple of places that folks just typically aren't allowed to go. When I came back from that, I was super convinced that I wanted to be a medical doctor, and I called Amy up, and she said, "Man, it's a great idea. You do fantastic in medical school. However, one problem." I said, "Well, what's that, Amy?" She says, "You are too old. Go to PA school so you can get out there and start practicing." And that's what I did. And I think that was the best advice she ever gave me. I was able to get practicing in much shorter time than it would have been. I'd probably just be finishing up my residency right now as this is being recorded had I gone to medical school. Man, if I'd not been following Jesus, I never would have crossed my mind to do any of that. And I'd probably still be an unhappy IT guy. So there's a lot of other things along the way that happened that some folks might call coincidences. I like to think that they were carefully planned out steps that I wasn't even thinking of at the time, and that they taught me things and did things for me and were placed in my path specifically to prepare me for what was coming. For instance, for many years, I did not have my bachelor's degree. I think I was 20 years out of high school when I finally got around to getting it. When I moved into management at that IT company, I was being mentored formally by a fellow named Mark Dunn. And he actually asked me one day, he's like, "What's wrong with your resume?" And I said, "Well, I don't have a bachelor's degree." He's like, "Yeah, how long do you spend on that every time you go on a job interview?" I go, "Well, I got to talk for 5 minutes or so about why that is." He's like, "Okay, well, let's make that go away so that's not a problem. I'm going to put that in your training plan. We're going to have the company reimburse you for your education, and I want you to go out and get that bachelor's degree." And I did. Now, if Mark had never done that, I'd probably never have bothered about getting to that, and that would have been a complete barrier to me getting into PA school. So had Mark not taken that step and made me go get my degree, that never would have happened. When I was in the Navy, that actually taught me a lot about the big differences between things you want and things you need. In the military especially, you get down to knowing that very quickly. And that actually made it a lot easier for me to do a lot of things. But working in austere environments like Africa and things like that, sometimes you have to improvise. You might not always get to have all the luxuries you have in America. And that really helped me understand that and made it so that I could be effective working in a lot of those environments. If I'd have never gone to church, never heard about that mission, never gotten over to Africa, I'd have never been interested in medicine, and I never would have been a PA. If I had never gone to that church, New Hope Church, I would never have met my wife, Nancy. And there's probably nobody else that would put up with me the way she does. There's a whole lot of near misses in the early 80s of things that happened or didn't happen. Probably more of the things that didn't happen for just no good reason that made it so I actually lived long enough to be able to have some experiences and talk about all this. All that is some of the summarized reasons about why I blame Jesus, as well as Jeff Samsel, for me starting this podcast. And without being a follower of Jesus, I wouldn't have a fraction of the material we're going to talk about. As I said earlier, I'm usually pretty busy. I had 3 jobs, maybe 4 if you're counting the dive professional training. Recovering from shoulder surgery has made it so I actually have a fair amount of time on my hands. I had to slow down and really find things to do with my life. It's amazing when you're working at that level and then all of a sudden you find yourself unable to do anything, how much time you actually have. So now, while I've been spending the last few months trying not to move, strain, bump, or damage any of that lovely repair work Dr. Smith did, I've been writing podcast material and recording it. So since I've had all this time on my hands, that means this has been the perfect time for me to actually sit down and start this podcast and get things going and bring hopefully some useful content to you so that you can be entertained, maybe learn something, maybe get something out of things that I have been through, and hopefully that'll help you on your journey as well. Okay, well, that's it for today, and thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you guys soon. That's it for today's episode of Medical Mariner, Inc. Thank you all for listening. If you want to support the podcast, please like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review where you are listening. If you have suggestions for content, you can shoot me an email at medicalmarinerinc@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. Medical Mariner, Inc. is written and produced by Paul Stewart. Content is copyright protected. If you wish to rebroadcast, you may do so if you broadcast the episode in its entirety. If you wish to use a portion of this content in any way other than its entirety, please email at medicalmarinerinc@gmail.com to discuss licensing. You may find me on Instagram as InkHeavy. Thanks for listening, and I hope to hear from you soon.